Christine Rosen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, there's obviously a lot of concern about how AI is going to change the world. Jonathan Haidt has been on the podcast in the past and has since written a mega best-selling book about the impact that social media has, in particular on teenage girls and other people growing up deeply immersed in that kind of culture. You're concerned about a slightly perhaps less intense but much broader harm, which is how the experience all of us have of the world is now mediated by all the digital devices which have, entered every aspect of our life. Why should we broaden our concern in that kind of way and sort of rather than looking at, oh, those poor teenage girls growing up in this completely different environment, sort of look in the mirror and say, hey, what are we doing wrong? What's happening in our own lives?
Well, I was fascinated by these seemingly mundane experiences because I just started noticing more and more in the last, I would say, 10 years, how many of them are mediated that didn't used to be. And part of that's, of course, because as anyone under the age of 20 knows, I'm an old fogey. I'm Gen X, so I'm this hybrid generation that grew up without a lot of these tools and then embraced them in adulthood. And so I remember the before times. I remember before smartphones, before the internet. And it just struck me that we were very quickly running towards this assumption that every new thing was going to improve our lives. And I think in many cases that's true. But I think in the case of some of our daily interactions, and in particular our daily human interactions, how we interact with each other, both as individuals, as families, as communities, and in public space, those were starting to be transformed in ways that I think were worrisome. It wasn't entirely because of the digital technology, but the digital technology was enabling us to eliminate the kinds of friction and discomfort that used to be taken for granted as part of human relationships. And so I thought it was worth exploring other areas of life that we might have too quickly passed over and seen these tools and the smartphone in particular and internet and social media platforms as improvements on how to do things and question whether that was the case.
Yeah, so I'm torn about how to think about this subject because on the one hand, I take somewhat seriously the defense of smartphones that they just bundle in one incredibly useful tool all the different kinds of things that we might have done in the past, right? So earlier we might have had physical books that we schlepped around in order to read, and perhaps we had certain tapes in order to listen to an audiobook if we enjoyed that. And we had a physical telephone on which we called people up. And then we had a television in the living room on which we, watched the news. And so if you added up all of those different kinds of activities, they took up probably a lot of hours in the life of somebody in 1990 or 1980, right? Well, now we've bundled all of these things in one machine. And so, say, oh, you're spending all of this time on your smartphone. Well, actually, I'm spending time, brushing up my Chinese vocab and reading the newspaper and reading a book and listening to a book and speaking to my friends. What's wrong with all of that? Now, on the other hand, of course, there is this sense that because it's all in one machine, I certainly notice I have coffee with somebody and I sort of look at my phone every few minutes in a way that I wouldn't have suddenly glanced at a newspaper or switched on the television in the middle of a conversation. So how should we think about those two sort of ways of conceptualizing what's going on?
Well, you're absolutely right to point out that the way we spend our time hasn't entirely changed, and that all of these things are pursuits that human beings will continue to do, whether they have the technology or not. I think the qualitative difference here, though, is important, and that's because the mobility of the technology means these sorts of things are no longer place and time specific. And it turns out that how we interact as people, whether it's with our friends or with our families or at the office or wherever, that those boundaries of time and space tend to actually form how the quality of interaction plays out. So if you're having coffee with a friend and no one has a smartphone, you're going to most likely pay attention to each other, and it would be rude to put a book in front of your face while your friend is talking to you. But somehow as we navigate these new norms, people checking their phones under the table while their friend is talking to them, some people might find that rude and others might just say, I'm checking my messages. So the urgency and the nowness and the must respond on demand forms of contact are really new, and the speed with which we can transform time and space. So what that means is that our individual experiences, I think, in many ways have been improved in all of the ways you describe, but our collective experiences have become impoverished in important ways. So if you think about public space and the sort of subtle signals and rules that we have about how to behave in public space. When someone walks in a crowded elevator, you make eye contact. The polite ways we interact. If you bump into someone, you both say you're sorry. These actually are the grease the wheels of social interaction in a way that once they're removed, we start to notice and feel more anxiety, more tension, more frustration in those interactions. And we see this play out in odd ways. Road rage rates are increasing. People are expecting on-demand experiences all the time in public space. So in those very subtle ways, the technology encourages habits of mind and ways of behaving that are quite new, and that I think we're still working out the details of whether or not they're good for us or bad for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking through sort of what impact this has had on our collective experience. And one of the really striking things is that when the internet is invented in the 1990s, what the internet evangelists believe, but what most people think, is that it's going to connect us to each other. It's going to connect us to each other in the sense that it's going to just make it easier to speak to each other. I mean, in the 1990s, if you have a family member on the West Coast and live on the East Coast, it's expensive to speak to each other on the telephone. I grew up in Germany with family in Denmark and Sweden, and my grandparents would call me up for 2 or 3 minutes, every few days or once a week, and that was a very significant expense to them. So it's very reasonable to think, hey, once we are able to speak for no money or very, very little money, those family relationships are going to deepen. More broadly, we think, why is there prejudice against people in the world? Why are people tribal? Well, it's really hard to speak to somebody in Kenya. It's really hard to speak to somebody in Afghanistan. They're too far away. It's too expensive. You can send them a letter and, that will be delivered at relatively little cost, but it'll take, weeks. And then until you hear back, it's a month. And, how can you actually communicate? Once we're going to be able to just hang out through Skype or whatever on the internet, all these pleasures are going to fall away. Of course, what's happened instead is this kind of weird resurgence of identity. And so, that's a weird paradox of the internet, right? Like we blast the cost of communication out of existence, but rather than deeper family relationships, more social activity and greater understanding across cultural barriers, what we get is alienation, less time spent with each other, and a retreat into these kind of tribal forms of organization, which I think very few people would have predicted at the time. Now, to double click on the first part of this, why is it that this online experience seems to make it so much harder to find the time for in-person physical experience? Some of the statistics that are going around about that are about teenagers who spend much less time hanging out with each other, and perhaps as a result also have many fewer of the kind of landmarks of adulthood. They're less likely to drink, they're less likely to be in romantic relationships, and so on. But some of it is about adults. I saw a very interesting statistic recently that there's pretty convincing evidence to suggest that the number of parties, dinner parties, barbecues, etc. among adults has radically reduced over the course of the last 20 years. I think it's down by something over 40%. What explains that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned what I call the kumbaya history, the kumbaya moment in the history of the internet, the very early, and I remember these days, and I was as enthusiastic as the next person at the very beginning, this idea that connection would open up opportunities for people to really understand others better and connect more often, and the ease of communication would also ease our relationships with each other. But of course, that failed to really deal with human nature. And the problem, as I saw it in real time unfolding decade after decade with the internet and then the smartphone, was that everyone could be heard, but fewer and fewer people actually wanted to listen. And this goes to your question about in-person interactions. In-person interactions aren't always easy. They're often difficult. Learning how to read others' social signals, their facial expressions, their hand gestures, all these ways that we communicate that are actually not verbal, that we learn by practicing from a very young age. The first thing a baby looks at is a face. They want to look into, and the depth perception of an infant and newborn is just about the journey from lying in the crook of someone's arm to look at their mother or father's face. So we are hardwired evolutionarily to seek out the human face and to understand each other in this important way. So when you introduce a barrier to that, a screen of some sort, and social scientists have been studying this for decades now. You start to have things called like the online disinhibition effect, where you're more willing to say and do things because you know you have this barrier and you're not actually accountable in person, in physical space with another person, that you'll say and do things that you never would do before. And that's even when you're acknowledging your own identity, to say nothing of then the additional screen of anonymity. So we aren't...
And incidentally, I think that's a lot of what went into that strange cultural moment in 2020, with all of the irrational cancellations and all of those things. It's one thing to sit in a conference room of 20 people and say, this person over there is an evil racist, even for like a nice member of a community who's never done anything particularly bad. It's somehow a lot easier to type that into a chat or write that on Slack.
Absolutely. Well, because the consequences are not immediately felt by you. And you can also feel you exercise an enormous amount of control. And this is actually where, again, in human relationships, we cannot control the other person. And if we are habituated by spending hours and hours in mediated interactions, whether that's on a social media platform or in a Slack channel, we become habituated to this expectation that we should be able to just delete someone or, cancel them or all. I mean, look at the buttons on your computer. They actually are escape, cancel, delete. We cannot treat each other this way, but we spend most of our time communicating with these tools. So this is the old, the medium is the message. This is like we become more machine-like in our interactions rather than making machines that help us become better humans. That's I think where we see cancellation and all these sort of really radicalizing behaviors rewarded by these platforms. The platforms are designed to reward those kinds of interactions, not to reward thoughtfulness, ambiguity, and grace in conversation.
But shouldn't that create the opposite effect? I mean, again, you go back to first principles, and nearly everybody who was only presented with first principles rather than with empirical evidence in the 1990s got this wrong. So, there just seems to be a strong a priori logic which suggests one kind of conclusion, and that's just not the conclusion that is empirically played out. But you'd think that if on the one side the experience of being online is potentially scary and threatening, can lead to all of these conflicts. And at the same time, the ease of communication has become much greater. It's much easier to organize a get-together. It's much easier to say, hey, I have a free evening. Let me spontaneously reach out to my friends and invite them to come along. What you'd expect is for people to flee into the offline world, for there to be more barbecues, for there to be more people hanging out. And instead, what you seem to get is less and less of that. Now, I know, I guess part of that is just the addictive nature of algorithms and so on. I find it hard to really feel that from my own behavior. I certainly know that it's easy in a moment of idleness when you are in between doing something to think, oh, I'll just check my Instagram, and then suddenly, like half an hour later, you realize you've wasted half an hour watching random stupid reels. But I've never had the experience where I sort of am like, oh, I have this appealing social invitation, but I'd rather stay at home and watch reels. And so it's a little hard for me to sort of understand how this aggregate effect comes about. Why is it that this online experience ensnares us collectively so much, or changes the social incentive so much, or perhaps makes people so wary of, on real life interaction that, we get a 50% decline of people having backyard barbecues or something?
Well, I would say one thing is that you're likely of the generation that got to practice those skills before a lot of this was mediated. And so there is a real generational difference. Each new generation is spending less time face-to-face with each other. And I think that's in part because these are skills you practice. We used to take for granted that we didn't even think about it as practice. It was the only way of doing things. when you introduce an alternative, one that makes it much easier to communicate without any of the burdens of leaving your house or getting dressed or getting on a bus or, all of the challenges of just basic social interaction, human beings will choose the easy path every time. We know this about ourselves. And sometimes that's fine. But I think if you think about the younger generations, where all of their, or at least a majority of their interactions from a very young age were in this mediated environment, it becomes, and I have a lot of sympathy for these kids, there's a lot of anxiety in actually doing it the old-fashioned way. And I've spoken to a lot of kids who talk about this, that they want to get together with their friends, but first of all, getting enough people to sort of agree to that, and then everybody kind of going and putting their phones down and having those interactions. They enjoy that, and many of them do that. But it's a skill they have to practice now. They have to choose it deliberately. They have to overcome, whatever concerns they have logistically and about the inconvenience of it. And I do think that, again, human nature will choose the easy path, which means we still have emotional experiences in these mediated environments. We're feeling real things, even if we're sitting by ourselves in our room scrolling, Instagram Reels. And we're willing to accept that, I think, qualitatively limited experience over the qualitatively richer one, because it's more convenient, it's right there, and we don't have to think much about it.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep posing the same question to you over and over because it just puzzles me so much. I mean, what about just some of, I feel like the urge of teenagers to hang out with friends is just so strong. And obviously, when you look at the decline of romantic relationships, the urge for romantic connection and the sexual urges, I would have thought so strong in humans that it could overcome that, and yet it doesn't appear to be. I mean, I just spent 2.5 weeks in China, and I spoke to somebody who's doing research there and has a lot of access to data, who quite credibly showed me not only that the number of romantic relationships has significantly declined in China, that a lot of people are not getting married, not interested in getting married, and not interested in having kids, which is of course reflected in the birth rates. But also that when you ask people about their priorities in life, when you ask young people in particular about their priorities in life, anything like love and romantic relationships is the thing that they're least likely to mention as important, and the thing that they're most likely to mention affirmatively as unimportant to them. And I was slightly skeptical of this. I think there's a kind of slightly orientalizing strain of journalism and research as, these weird people in Korea and Japan who never date anymore. But I talked to a bunch of people there, and this seems at least to be believed by smart people in China itself. That this is so. It's not an Orientalist view. It's certainly a view that is shared by smart observers in China. That may still mean it's wrong. It may still mean it's missing something. But I was again really struck by that. I mean, isn't the need, the desire to find a romantic partner to share that aspect of life strong enough to overcome this? Again, if you were sort of giving me all of this as a prediction 15, 20 years ago, I think I just wouldn't take it seriously. I think I just say, I just don't buy it. But there's enough empirical evidence to suggest that this is really happening. And yet I struggle to sort of make sense of how all of these mechanisms you point to, which seem perfectly reasonable and plausible to me, can possibly be strong enough to override what seems to me pretty fundamental aspects of human nature.
Well, it's funny you say you wouldn't have believed this prediction, because one of the first assignments I gave myself at the New Atlantis when we founded this journal more than 20 years ago was early online dating. Internet dating was just starting to gain steam. And I was fascinated by whether exactly this question, was it going to change how people meet, fall in love, and form families? And in those early stages, we didn't have a ton of data. We just had impressions, and we could sort of study in small scale some of these early sites. But what I instantly saw were they seem almost contradictory. But what you're describing, I think, is this principle coming to fruition. It's an aversion to risk. But if there's anything that's risky in life, it's romantic relationships. There's always risk. And the willingness to take that risk, I think you're absolutely right. The human nature overcomes the risk aversion, because you think, no, I want to meet someone. I want to fall in love. What I was finding on these sites was that people were forming habits of mind and using them that said, put all the risk up front. I want to know everything about you, a whole dossier. I don't want to find that out, and I can't waste time with someone who might have this weird thing that I don't like. So there was that impulse, combined with, and this seems a contradiction, but even if you did find someone you like, there was always in the back of your mind, well, there are thousands more other people out there who I matched with, who I might like better. So there's a seeming, limitless number of options, and then a more aversion to the risk of a real romantic relationship. And those forces combined, I think, is what we're seeing play out with some of these younger generations in particular. To go out into the world, into the wild, as they say, and just meet someone is almost unheard of in many generations. And I know lots of people who've happily married. They found themselves on dating. They found their spouse on a dating app. The ones that are most successful, though, were the ones I think that very quickly out of the gate, like Jewish dating sites, Catholic dating sites, vegetarian dating sites, carnivore dating sites, people who very specifically said, this is my limiting principle and I won't move beyond it. They could find each other. And that was harder in the pre-internet age. But the combination of risk aversion and the seeming limitless options that this mediated experience of meeting others provides, I think has genuinely changed everyone. And the flattening cultural effect of doing these things online means that I don't think it's just because some societies are more conformist than others. We're more independent, but we're all behaving this way. This is the mating practices of the human race have altered significantly across the board when you look at some of these studies.
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical about sort of overemphasizing the evilness of social media companies and platforms. I think a lot of this is an emergent behavior of how our psychology works in these online platforms, more than sort of them doing like brilliant evil things to keep us addicted. One of the most shocking things I've heard, though, about online dating platforms, which I believe is true, is that they obviously have access to your IP address, and they obviously know when two people have matched. And apparently one thing that happens is that when two users are seen multiple times at the same IP address, suggesting that perhaps we're starting to form a relationship, the algorithm will deliver more attractive new options to the members of this emergent couple in order to tempt them away from their potential unit and say, hey, there's more hot people who I could be meeting instead.
There's a hotter, better person 2 blocks away, right? No, of course. I mean, it's a business.
That really is one of the most evil things I've heard, I have to say. It's something, and of course, one of the sort of strange dynamics on social media is that there's slightly different ways in which men and women tend to behave and rate each other on those platforms. It's quite well documented. So men, swipe right, evince interest in a much greater share of women than women do in men. And what tends to happen is that there's a big tail of men who can't get any matches online.
Right.
And there's a relatively small number of men who get a lot of matches. And then, of course, those men are often tempted to just go on, many, many dates with different women, perhaps sleep with many different women, and then move on to the next one. And the women get burned because women often are ones who, are looking for a serious relationship. And they feel that each time again, they go on 4 or 5 dates with somebody, start to develop a real romantic interest in them, and then suddenly that doesn't work out, and so eventually they become very, very bitter and angry at that experience. And so there's a kind of, there's sort of women who feel like they're being treated in a very unfair way by the people they meet on those platforms, and men who can't get dates who feel that those platforms are kind of locking them out. And so you have, by two very different routes, people perhaps tuning out of the dating market.
Well, and one of the things about becoming a fully formed adult is learning how to handle rejection. But I think what's changed is that I don't think we were designed to handle rejection at this scale. Whether it's the woman who, has a couple of dates with a guy and then he ghosts her, or the man who can't get a date with any of the women because they all swipe they swipe left rather than right. That kind of industrialized rejection, which the platforms enable, perhaps we're not wired yet to deal with that. Now, will we learn to adjust these behaviors? I think we have. I think there continue to be interesting markets in the online dating world. When women, for example, got sick of some of the larger platforms like Match.com, you had Plenty of Fish. You had sites develop that were designed by women so that the women could make the first offer of interest. And so there are all these ways that you can game the system. But from my perspective, the question we should ask is, has this shown to be a better system than some of the other ways we used to do this when we were out in public space, where we did allow for time and a slow reveal of each other's personalities to someone with whom we had interest. I think there's a lot of impatience baked into this system too, and I think, again, particularly for romantic relationships, but for friendships and family as well, you do have to be patient with other people. And these devices, which we spend, again, 7 or 8 hours a day on, they do not encourage patience by any stretch of the imagination. And I do think we see that bleeding over into people's interactions with each other.
So one other strange thing about online dating is that I remember very vividly when those sites sort of came up. It was weird to be online dating, right?
Yes,
I mean, online
no one
dating for
wanted
a
to
number of
admit it,
years,
right? Yeah.
right? It was something for losers, right? Like, what, you can't go and find a girlfriend or a boyfriend in the real world. You have to go to these online sites. There's something really
Right.
odd about you. And now, of course, it's been completely normalized. At this point, a plurality of relationships are formed through online dating. In younger age groups, I believe it's a
Yeah.
majority. It continues to rise very, very quickly. Now, again, you might have predicted in the 1990s that it would be easier to get people to make friends online than to date online because
Right.
the stakes are lower. Because in a way it's easier to say, hey, we share this, obsessive interest in some random band or some random thing. Let's be friends, right? And yet, if you're looking for friends online, that is still a little bit weird. Now, you might make friends online and kind of random. I have Twitter friends, I suppose, from like commenting on each other's things. When mention like, oh, let's talk about this, and but you're part of also a professional circle or something. But like, attempt. I think Bumble, for example, had an attempt to like do a friend dating thing where you sort of use the platform, but rather than opting into a romantic form of matchmaking, you opt into I want to make friends. And especially in a relatively mobile society like the United States, you'd think that there's a real understandable need for that, right? Hey, I just took a job in Cleveland, Ohio.
Right.
I don't know anybody here, right? I'm not going to college here, where sort of college takes care of presenting you with lots of people who might end up your friends. I want to go and grab coffee with a few people who might become my friends. So you'd think that this algorithm somehow can facilitate that form of sociability. And yet, for whatever reason, even as romantic online matchmaking has become completely mainstream in society, dominant in society, that form of friend making is still quite marginal. And even for various forms of it exist, meetup and so on, that's still regarded as a little bit strange, where you need to go online to make a friend. What's wrong with you? I mean, is the solution here to not to sort of turn to the offline world, but to expand the online world? I mean, would it be helpful to have a change in norms where when you move to a new city, you really can make friends online in this kind of way? Or, why is it that there is this, again, somewhat surprising discrepancy between these two different things you might think of doing online?
Well, I would say, yeah, meetup groups are great and people do use them, but they don't have the ubiquity that I think you're pointing to that online dating does. The difference is this. I think the internet can be, and social media platforms in particular, can be very useful if you have an existing interest and you move to a new place and you want to join a group that's already doing that. You can find those people more efficiently and join that real world group, and that's a great thing.
How do I find somebody who's playing pickup soccer in
Exactly.
Cleveland, Ohio?
That's wonderful. But I think we have to remember, and the great Neil Postman, cultural critic of the 20th century, made this point about television and politics, which I still think resonates. He said, when you introduce television into the realm of politics, you no longer have politics with television. You have a new politics. And I think that's true of friendships and romantic relationships, even neighborly relationships. When you introduce a social media platform to that relationship, you no longer have that thing anymore. You have a new thing. So think of Nextdoor, which was created with great fanfare to bring neighbors together. You would be able to communicate, garage sales, emergencies. It would all be great. I did a little study of Nextdoor, and in some cases it works really well. It gets news out to the local neighbors. You have to identify yourself. You have to live in the neighborhood to contribute. And so there was some gatekeeping for that platform that hadn't existed before. But it very quickly devolved into like the worst sort of vicious gossip, finger pointing, tattling on each other. I mean, I have a pretty active Nextdoor neighborhood group that I just watch in awe and amazement. again, because at scale, because of the online disinhibition effect, we are not acting neighborly. We're not going out into the street because it's easier to sit at our keyboards and have our say than it is to actually confront someone and say, hey, your dog's a little crazy. Can you put him on a leash or something like that? Because again, the risk, the sort of, you have to actually deal with another human being who might be volatile, who might be unfriendly, who might say something scary. And that's where I do think we need to remember, even with friendships, even with romantic relationships, what we're talking about here isn't the old way. It's a new thing. And we're still developing norms to adapt to that. And I have a lot of confidence that we'll find those. We already have found some. But we have to at least acknowledge that it isn't the same thing, because those old rules don't apply in many of these cases.
I wonder if another development here is that you can get a lot of shallow community that then replaces deep community. The ease of finding shallow community somehow pushes away deep community. Now, the extreme form of this that I see sometimes is, for all the different social media platforms, I kind of quite like Reddit because I think that its algorithm is better and it can just be sort of entertaining in weird ways. But, you so often get somebody say, I've been friends with this person for, 20 years, and they said this one thing to me yesterday that I find kind of hurtful or whatever, and I've decided to cut them out of my life completely. Am I the asshole?
Yes.
And I was saying, no. Yeah, exactly. One of the best community stuff. And the answer is always, no. If somebody has said something that doesn't value you perfectly in the perfect way at every moment, they are toxic and you must cut them out of your life. I think that's gotten a little bit better over the last few years, but there's certainly a tendency where these members of this very shallow community of people who you've never met personally, who've never might have had a second two-way conversation with, who perhaps are just commenting on some random post of yours, are encouraging you to cut those real-life community ties. Now, that's a particular example. I'm sure you can find examples that go in the other direction and so on. But perhaps that's perhaps that's part of what's going on here.
I think that's a really important point, because what it shows is that, again, humans are hardwired to seek the approval and connection to others in our communities. Our community can potentially online be limitless. So if you are spending less time in person with the people who know you best, who might provide, for example, a leavening influence on your impulse to cut someone out of your life because they looked at you sideways, that person would be like, you might be overreacting, think about it, sleep on it. They would give you all that good advice that our friends and loved ones give us when we're acting crazy. But that's one person, one voice, if you happen to see them or text them this question. But then you can go online and you can get thousands and thousands of strangers telling you, you are brave, you have to do this, I did this too. And you suddenly, again, our urge to belong and connect is triggered and rewarded. You're rewarded for doing the more extreme thing, even if it's not actually what's best for you. And combine that with a very presentist way of going about our daily lives. We want instant answers, just like we want our seamless order delivered instantly when we feel like a cheeseburger. But there's this tendency to not really think, not take the time. Again, this speaks to this patience point, but we're becoming habituated to those forms of making decisions. Look, my favorite Reddit thread, instant karma, when people who drive like maniacs immediately get pulled over by the cops. I love watching those videos. I was like, finally, justice. But there, we have these impulses that when taken to an online platform become extreme, but then we get extreme rewards for them. And so we keep doing them. And it's difficult to step back. It's one of the reasons why I don't check my phone during interstitial moments of my day, because it's too easy, as you said earlier, to end up an hour and a half later wondering what you have just done with your time. There's a version of that with relationships. Go seek out someone whose judgment you actually trust and listen to them, ask them that question. Don't go to Reddit first. You can still go to Reddit, but get the wisdom and judgment of someone who knows you first. That's what we're not doing. We're skipping that step now.
I just had a thought which is very random and may not make sense once I say it out loud. I have a gripe against primary elections in the United States. And the reason why I have a gripe against primary elections is that I think that there's two kinds of mechanisms which I trust. One is stakeholders, right? So in Europe, most political parties have party members who pay party dues and they elect officers, and those officers make the most important decisions, like who to nominate for Chancellor of Germany or whatever, right? So these people have a long-term stake in the well-being of the organization. They've put a lot of work and effort into it, and so that they have a sense of its history, of past successes and failures. Right, you have skin in the game. Then I believe in democratic elections in which everybody participates and votes, because I actually think that most people are reasonable. I don't always agree with the majority of the opinion of the majority of my fellow citizens, but by and large, I think people are reasonable and decent, and that's why democracy works. That's why I believe in democracy. The problem with primary elections is that it's selected for high engaged, low stakes people. Right? People who are very engaged, who are willing to turn out, which most people are not for a primary election, but we don't have skin in the game like insiders. In a way, what these kind of online communities recreate is the primary system, right? It's not your mom and dad, it's not your best friend, it's not the stakeholders who know your history and know, you've already cast 3 people out of your life over random reasons. Perhaps you're just a little oversensitive, right? It's not the people who actually care about your long-term well-being. It's not the average person who may be much more psychologically well-calibrated, who doesn't have that kind of stake in your personal well-being, but who probably has common sense. It is, the small subsection of people who spend all of their life commenting on people's "Am I the asshole?" threads on Reddit, right? and they're likely to be psychologically, with all honor to the great community that is "Am I the asshole?", psychologically pretty different from the average person, right? So it's a kind of it's a weird selection effect of who you're allowing to make those decisions for you.
Well, there's also, I think what you're pointing to as well is something that certainly American politics has been suffering from for a little while now, which is the decline in the power and respect for institutions. So you did used to have active political parties in this country that had some power and exercised judgment over who should run at the state level, federal level, and whatnot. And that disappeared. And it actually, in our current populist moment, it's whoever has the most followers on X or Blue Sky or wherever. And we do see that. My wonderful colleague Yuval Levin has written about this, about how the institutions that should shape people's behavior and judgment, and to which we should appeal for authority, like Congress and elsewhere, have flipped. And now you have people using the institutional platform to promote their individual goals. And if there's the individual control that is offered each of us when we go online is encouraged in part. We're a radically individualistic society in the U.S. I think a lot of our politics has become this game of one-upsmanship, not just among, as you say, the highly engaged but perhaps not completely mainstream people who participate at the primary level and these online discussions, but our politicians themselves are now reflecting that impulse because they are also rewarded. I can't say often enough how on the right and the left you have a whole bunch of politicians who are more concerned about followers than constituents. Their constituents are the people who they are supposed to answer to, but they answer to their followers, many of whom don't live in their district, have no concern beyond, signaling their tribal loyalty online. And this has been bad. This has been very bad for democracy, and it continues to pose a challenge in our election process. In our personal relationships, though, you're absolutely right. The mediating institutions, the human institutions, I think I sometimes got called a scold because I love to take the quiet car on the Acela train, and I'm the first person who politely jumps up and says, "This is the quiet car. Could you please stop talking on your phone?" And I try to be nice, but I'm pretty firm, and I'm that scold. But that's a social role I'm fulfilling, and you see that deteriorating. First, because everybody's just, staring at their screen, doesn't care about the people around them in public space. But that's a kind of institutional structure that we shouldn't let go of easily. Yes, we can film bad behavior on our phones and make people infamous in real time in a split second. But are we actually doing the hard work of being good human beings who call out bad behavior and actually hold someone accountable in real time? Not just filming them, but going up and saying, hey, knock it off, or break up the fight. Don't film it and post it on an internet site. So that's a kind of cultural, institutional function that I fear is disappearing.
Yeah, this question of social norms is really important because some social norms are very healthy, right? It's very good to have one car on the Amtrak. There's also other cars where you can go and have conversations.
They better never get rid of that car.
In which people can do some work and enjoy some quiet, right? And it takes people to get the balance right? I mean, if every time that somebody spoke, and I've seen that sometimes happening on the quiet car, people just shout at them and
Yeah.
create a huge ruckus. Like, A, that's counterproductive because then you're disturbing people more with your reprimand than people
Right.
were originally with their disturbance. B, it just becomes a very unpleasant social environment. At the same time, if nobody ever enforced the norm at all, the norm would very quickly go away. And again, I think some of the elements of the in-person world encourage the right calibration of this. It can go wrong, but we have long evolved instincts for how to do that. Online, what we end up with is very vague norms, which are not as bound to a specific locus as the Amtrak quiet car, right? So different norms can clash, or you never know which norm is going to be applied to which situation. That then can be enforced out of all proportion with the underlying offense. We're recording this a few days after, a relatively small incident, which is, probably like literally a million others happening every day, which is two spouses cheating on each other. But that, has consumed the internet and led to a huge degree of opprobrium for the people involved, in a way that indicates this. I'm speaking, of course, of the Coldplay couple kissing on the kiss cam. That's a lot of season case. Now, of course, there's that kind of fear, right? If I go out into the real world, I might be shamed in this way that feels out of proportion to the underlying offense. But as with many sort of behaviors of cancellation, there's some of these cases that become very famous, but lots and lots which are not. And people experience now as teenagers all kinds of forms of, all-consuming drama, often with forms of cancellation in the local community that never makes any headlines. It's certainly never written up on the New York Times and doesn't go viral on Twitter with tens of millions of people watching, that entertaining 6-second clip. But that nevertheless may just leave people so traumatized that they say, I'm just worried about any form of social interaction that might potentially expose me to that form of collective response.
Well, and this is an irony of our current age, because one of the early promises of these technologies is that they would be liberatory, right? We would have more freedom, we'd have more accountability, we'd have more control as individuals. The state can't crush us because we can film all these bad actors of this that they're sent out by the state. But in fact, because we can all survey each other now, we behave differently because we know this from many studies, that if you know you're being watched, you're going to act in ways that are different from when you're not being watched. But there's also this aspect of it that I think isn't given enough attention, and that's how it shapes our expectations for justice. Because these platforms don't just reward embarrassing, public figures. They reward moral grandstanding, and they turn almost every single discussion into a moral discussion. And everything isn't a moral debate, just like everything shouldn't be politics. But if it's rewarded on these platforms where most people are having their conversations, where unfortunately now most people are getting their news, reading, seeing a link but never reading the story, then that exacerbates this human tendency to actually mete out justice and judge others' behaviors and shame people sometimes too. I mean, I feel for the families of those two spouses they themselves have been brought into this global shaming campaign and the mockery that's ensued. Now, the punishment of this kind of shaming is way orders of magnitude out of kilter in terms of how humans usually judge and deal with bad behavior within communities. And that's something that I think the outsourcing of that to the internet has been a very bad thing, not just for politics, but for personal relationships. How many times have you seen out in the wild of some people starting to argue and everyone pulls out their phones? It's like, well, now I'm going to film you. I'm going to show your worst self. And it's a threat. It has become a weapon in the hands of people who don't want to deal with a conflict in the way that we should. It just becomes a deflection and a tool to shame people. And that, I think, is very bad. That's been going on for a long time. And we have not developed norms, as I think that recent episode that you just described demonstrates. We haven't figured that part of it out yet.
My producer rightly chides me that the Coldplay couple was cuddling, not kissing, which is mostly upsetting since there would have been
Kissing
an
was implied.
alliteration. I'm sure they kissed at some point. That did seem. I
That was
don't think
not
that
an
is
HR approved cuddle. Let's just put it that way.
Yes, it wasn't a friendly a friendly cuddle. It wasn't a cuddle between friends. One obvious way of thinking about this is the village in the city, and perhaps there was a golden period of urban anonymity, which is never coming back. So in the village, you didn't have anonymity because your friends and your neighbors and your relatives always know what you're up to. And of course, that is very restrictive to people. It also, by the way, led to a certain set of very socially conservative norms, which were in part necessitated by the state of reproductive technology at the time, but in part facilitated by the inbuilt forms of social surveillance in the sort of geographic modalities in which most human beings lived for much of human history, right? You were just very easily observed. So then you had this brief period where you had 50 or so percent of the world population living in cities, in relatively anonymous places, where your neighbors might have been able to observe you, but they were not part of the same friend and kinship network, and they probably didn't care that much about what you were doing. And that actually gave people a lot of freedom. One way of thinking about what happens with these forms of online surveillance and social shaming and people taking out the video is that you have kind of sporadic revillagization, right? Mm-hmm. Normally you can go around New York doing whatever you want, but if for whatever reason what you do is sufficiently outrageous or terrible, or it's just a common behavior, like cheating on your spouse, which sadly is relatively common, but it somehow gets caught in a way that captures the imagination because it's a perfect 6-second clip, right? Mm-hmm. Of people diving in shame out of a frame of a picture and so on, right? And suddenly you are subject to the norms of the village of the past. Now, this conversation, this is a relatively obvious point. People have made it that the internet turns us into a global village in some very bad ways. What's interesting, though, and which this conversation makes me think, is that the village comes with inbuilt strengths, right? My friend, who's of Greek origin, always says, my country has solved the problem of loneliness. It is impossible to be lonely in a Greek village because the moment you step out, your neighbors talk to you and chat with you and ask you about your day. And, I know when I spend time in Italy, there's a 1-minute walk from the house in which my mother lives part of the year to the local bar in the village, and often it takes you half an hour because you run into so many neighbors and acquaintances and so on, and you just want to get my damn coffee, but it takes you half an hour to get there because you have a really interesting, nice, friendly chat with people. It's one of the beautiful things about living there. Now, what you're describing is sort of the social opprobrium and the judgmentalness, and therefore perhaps, as you see sometimes in supposedly progressive spaces, the emergent conservative social norms, mm-hmm. right? It is the left that is saying, it's everybody kind of mentioned it in the last days, but it is in part supposedly progressive people saying, these evil adulterers, right? In a way that sounds a little bit like kind of 19th century school moms, yes. But without the benefits of the village, without the deep social ties, without the social network, without the person who says, hey, you look a little sad today, everything all right, can I come over and make you some food or something, right? So it's kind of like the worst version of the village, actually.
Well, it is because there's no trust in that village. So if you think about the old forms of that, particularly in the urban, so one of the concerns about all the people who fled the small village to go to this big city was that then they would be kind of anonymous and lost and without protection. And I think the work that Jane Jacobs did in New York, for example, was so fascinating because she said, actually, there is this whole informal network of eyes on the street where people do, just as you described in that Italian village, we're watching each other, but not with hostility. It's out of, and not necessarily with benevolence either, but just we're all in this is our shared space. Let's all just keep an eye on each other. Now, that meant that, yeah, you probably did have one or two busybody, nosy people who are going to bother you with stuff you would rather they not know about you. But it also was a protective mechanism. If you needed help, you could ask several people, and because the eyes on the street were all in it together. And that's where I worry particularly about the younger generations, because we don't have eyes on the street now. We have surveillance of constant surveillance of each other. And that, I think, encourages, because of the way the platforms are designed, a kind of instant rush to judgment. So what that means for these younger generations of kids, if that's the expectation in the world they grow up in, is they don't have in bioethics, we have this term called an open future. It's why a lot of bioethicists argue you should not do genetic manipulation of your children, because you're robbing them of all the opportunities that an open future that wouldn't have had that genetic manipulation would give them, and it's permanent. You can't take it back. So we don't genetically engineer our kids for that reason, because it robs them of becoming who they robs them of freedom. But in a lot of ways, this concept...
Wait. I mean, I know this is a side note, but aren't the kids going to be determined by one genetic makeup or the other? And if you change their genetic makeup, sorry.
Well, so yes, I mean, they're going to be half of their parents on either side, but what you don't do is take an embryo and say, I'm going to select for height, and I'm going to select, I mean, some people would even argue, barring a genetic condition that's sex related, I'm going to select for sex, I'm going to do these things, because that's the parents imposing on the future of this child without the child's consent. So pathways from the moment that embryo is engineered by the parents, pathways of freedom for that future child are cut off. And so that's
interesting. I guess, I get the argument. I guess it seems to me like there's a distinction between there's a range of different possibilities, and the parents are selecting between those possibilities, which seems to be an accurate description of that case. And a rather different idea, which is that the child, we don't want parents to overdetermine the choices of their children. In one obvious way, this is one of the key arguments against female genital mutilation, right? That you are depriving the child of the possibility of exploring various forms of sexual pleasure by doing this kind of operation. And even though we accept that parents have a lot of authority over young children because children can't make choices for themselves, what we don't accept is that parents can foreclose those kind of choices later in life. At a certain point, when the kid turns 18 or whatever the age is, they should be able to make this choice for themselves. But here there's a case where, whether your genetic makeup is A or your genetic makeup is B, you have no agency over that, right? You're born one way or the other, and once you're born, you have no choice. So it's not clear to me that the parents are reducing the choice of the embryo. They are determining one pathway or the other, but since either of the hypothetical children wouldn't have any choice in what the genetic makeup was anyway, you're not reducing the choice that the children have.
I suppose it's more the overdetermination point. So, for example, take sex selection, which is where a lot of these debates happen. Parents who've had two boys, but they desperately want a girl. Well, what expectations are built into their understanding of what a girl child will do? What if that girl grows up to be a tomboy who doesn't want to take ballet, and they wanted a ballerina? So it's the imposition of expectations that if they're seen all the way through, that child will have a miserable childhood, but also not be able to fully develop. And it's probably a bad analogy, but when you think about young people growing up online and the embarrassing mistakes everyone makes, I mean, I, for one, was in the marching band in high school, and thank God the internet was not around yet, because I would never, it wouldn't have prevented me from having a future career, but it would have been an embarrassing moment in my past. Those embarrassing moments track people now throughout their lives. So you can, and that's the inability to have a reinvention, which is actually a core value in the history of America. This idea that you can, when we had a frontier, you can just leave where you're from, go somewhere else, and start over. You can't do that in the same way. In the same way that, as you said earlier, everybody was embarrassed when early online dating, was going on, and they wouldn't admit to it. Now, however, I had a friend who was set up with someone, not online, but through another friend. And she Googled this man, and he didn't have an internet presence, basically because of the work he does. But she found that highly suspicious. She's convinced he's a serial killer. So, and that's a very short span of time that our expectations, like, you must be out there on the internet. You must have this digital identity that people can examine and check. And so that, for children, for adults like us, I mean, that's fine. We just live with that reality. But if you grow up in a world where everything you've done is tracked, surveyed, photographed, put online, and your digital footprint by the time you're 12 years old is massive, forget what the big companies do in buying and selling that information. How does that form a healthy sense of self for someone who might hit 15 and go, actually, I'm not the goth who had all those piercings. I like philosophy and want to do this other thing. It's more and more challenging for kids to develop a healthy sense of self and make all those mistakes. And I think that's where John Haidt's work is a good starting point for saying maybe some of the crises of these kids is that they don't have that freedom anymore, and they know it. They know it all the time. Every time they look at their phones, they know it.
I'm always a little skeptical of materialist explanations of social norms and so on, but it does seem striking how strongly these forms of digital communication have shifted social norms in ways that would have been surprising to me 20 years ago or even 5 years ago. So on the one hand, I do think that there is a shift towards much more small c conservative social norms because what were regarded as, real but limited moral infractions can now be shamed at scale in ways that make the social penalty for it much more intense. So I think, the example of the cuddling Coldplay couple is
Nice alliteration.
one of those. Yes. On the other hand, you have social norms that existed against things like sex work,
Right.
just totally being obliterated. I think the most interesting thing here is OnlyFans, which is a platform that allows you to follow, particular quote unquote creators, particular people who are, engaging in various forms of soft or hard pornography. And it's not just interesting that there is clearly a need for social connection there, right? I mean, back in the 1970s, I imagine that people bought, Tatler magazine or something like that because they want to consume some form of pornography and you had to pay in order to do that.
You had to leave your house in order to get it too, which is
And you had to leave your house in order to get it. Now, of course, you can consume, literally, probably there's more free online pornography on the internet than you can watch in the rest of your life. I imagine that there's enough videos to literally spend, even if you're 15 years old, the next 80 years of your life, all of your waking hours watching it, and you would never run out. And nevertheless, people are spending a lot of money to subscribe to these individual creators and have this parasocial relationship with them, where part of it is that I guess they might send you some message if you're a super subscriber or something, right? So you have this feeling of like some pseudo link to this person whose pornography you're consuming. The other thing is, and I haven't looked into these data points, but I keep coming across them on social media and some newspaper articles, that the number of people who are now involved in this enterprise is just enormous. And I've heard some statistics that something like 5%, according to some statistics, perhaps even more than that, of young women in the United States have an OnlyFans account. So that means that 1 in 20 young people are engaged in the enterprise of marketing and selling the sexuality online, with some of them making enormous sums of money, but as in
Most
any
not,
kind
yeah.
of superstar economy, most of them, I'm sure, making very little or no money at all. That is just such a fascinating and fundamental and in my mind quite concerning transformation of society.
Well, I think it's less alarming when you think about how they have the sort of water in which they've been swimming for most of their lives, particularly if they're under the age of 30. And that's a world where they are always performing and they're always expected to perform. And they live in a very mediated environment where they can filter their own, they can look however they want. They can filter things. They have a lot of control at the same time that their private world is shrinking incredibly quickly. I mean, how many people under the age of 20, when they are alone, are truly alone? Not with the phone, not with some way of entertaining themselves. And the OnlyFans thing speaks to a loneliness, but also a risk aversion about human relationships that we were talking about earlier. You want some human connection. I don't think, although we do see the rise of these AI chatbots also filling a role for people, but it's risk-free in the sense that you just pay your money. It's very transactional. A lot of these platforms encourage that kind of transactional approach to each other, but that can only be embraced at the scale you're describing if people have already formed habits of mind that prime them to accept transactionality in their human relationships. And I do think younger generations do have these very transactional ways of understanding, like, this person's toxic, I'll cut them off. I can just delete that account. I can I can ghost this person. These are all ways, I think, to speak to your raising the point about norms, where the norms are not working. And what we've filled in with those norms are kind of the worst excesses of human nature run rampant. And I completely agree with you that it's harmful. I mean, if you're a 25-year-old making an extra $1,000 a month with your weird OnlyFans account, lots of people be like, you go, girl. Okay, but fast forward 20 years and you have young children and that stuff is still out there. And, you go in for a parent-teacher conference and your kid's teacher goes, oh, I used to look at your OnlyFans account. And maybe that's not who you see yourself as. Maybe you did that for 6 months because you were young and you needed the money. That is never gone now. That is part of your identity forever. And I think it doesn't allow for growth. And I do see this with a lot of young people. They get stuck in a moment and they don't have the opportunity to grow past it, in part because they live their lives and their work lives often too are online. And that mediation doesn't give them that private world. We need a backstage. Irving Goffman, the great sociologist in the 20th century, talked about how every human being needs that backstage area where they can just do their weird stuff and not be judged. And for most of us, that's our private home. But what's the first thing we reach for in the morning, the last thing we touch at night? It's our phones. That has completely inundated our private time and our private world. And I think that's where we can start to make the choice to say, no, not here. You can use that here, but I'm not going to bring that in and mediate that human experience.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of this is possible social opprobrium, right? Perhaps at a later stage in your life, these images come back to haunt you in some kind of way. One answer to that from a progressive wing would be to say, well, so therefore we have to fight even more against social opprobrium. There's other harms that are potentially involved as well. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge the possibility that some people genuinely enjoy sex work, that for them this has no psychological harms, etc. I'm sure that that's true. I do worry that for a lot of people, and you obviously have a lot of first-person accounts of people writing and talking about that, it does become something that they regret, that they feel alienates them from their own sexuality, that creates this very objectified sort of experience of their own selves.
Right.
And again, the idea that we have increased the number of people who are involved in that kind of activity by probably 100-fold or 1,000-fold relative to 20 years ago is just a really striking aspect of this moment.
Well, and to say nothing of what it does to people once they do form a connection with another human being in the real world, out in the wild. Say you have a partner or a husband or a wife, and you still have this connection to an online relationship on OnlyFans or through with porn. Like you have this thing that you can't give up. That is going to impose on your real day-to-day interactions. And the interesting thing is when those break out into scandals that people discuss. I was remembering the Anthony Weiner scandal. And this has happened in a lot of scandals where some of the women were saying, well, we had a relationship. And the politician's like, I never touched her. We never met. But there was a relationship. They're both right? He's, the guy who was cheating on his spouse will say, well, we never actually, had physical congress. But they were connected. And that threat, I think, to the early formation of relationships is another strand that is playing into this question of why people are struggling to meet, settle down, have families. I mean, the birth rate is a thing. It's as I remind some of my young students, I'm like, it is declining and everywhere. It's not just in the US, it's not just in the West. And so something is changing about how we understand human connection and family formation and having children is always a vote for the future. So somehow in some weird way, we're not voting for the future anymore by making different choices.
You said something interesting a few minutes ago when you pointed out that the jump from just being a random 18, 19-year-old to selling your wares on OnlyFans seems huge, perhaps to somebody in my generation. But one of the things that makes that transition more seamless is that a lot of young people already feel like they're always on a stage, right? Yeah. They're already curating the online presence in order to be as desirable as possible, partially in a sexual way, partially in other ways, on Instagram and TikTok and so on, throughout the process of being teenagers and growing up. And so the extra step of saying, well, why don't I take off a couple of more items of clothing and make some money of that, perhaps seems less striking than it does to somebody who didn't grow up with those forms of public self-presentation on social media. I think that's really interesting. It reminded me of a different viral video taken not at a concert but in the periphery of a concert. I don't know if you happen to have caught that. It was perhaps a year or so ago that this was going around a lot. And it was of a girl in the 1990s who was traveling around following some band she liked, giving an interview about why she's doing that. And a lot of people commented on sort of how charming she was. And what's interesting about it, she was a charming, good-looking girl, but she wasn't strikingly beautiful. She wasn't certainly wearing anything particularly revealing. She didn't seem like she was so charming that she could go and be, the next lead in a romantic comedy in Hollywood. I think a lot of what people were reacting to was the sight of somebody 18 or 19 or whatever years old speaking to the camera in a way that's not practiced, speaking in a camera in a way that feels idiosyncratic and personal and unmediated, in a way that is not shaped by all of these influences we've recently seen. And it was really striking to me both, but I also found that video very winning as a result. But sort of what an outsized reaction it sort of elicited on social media because it felt so unaccustomed.
Well, this is important because what a lot of people are seeking when they seek connection is authenticity, authentic connection. And so much of what we settle for in our mediated relationships is ersatz. It's not authentic. But the other thing these platforms do, and again, I'm thinking of politicians who've honed this skill very well, is the simulacrum of authenticity. It's like, oh, here I am at home cooking this thing and talking to you about the bill I had before Congress. But we know it's practiced, and we know they probably did 5 takes to get just the right little TikTok video that they could send out to all their followers. We mistrust it. So when we see someone genuine and winning who just spontaneously, sort of like the old local news would stick a microphone in someone's face when something had happened and they would just happen to be loitering, seeing what's happening. And they would say, I don't know, I live down the street. I had no idea he was the crazy guy he is, right? But that
he seemed very nice, always kept himself to himself. That's always the answer from neighbor, yeah.
Never made trouble. Those are the ones to watch. But that is something that I think we are correctly suspicious of online because so many people have figured out how to monetize fake authenticity and connect with it. There was this trend for a while on Instagram where lots of young women said, we're not going to filter anymore. We're going to say, like, I woke up like this, and this is the real me with my messy room. But even that very quickly became a highly curated, practiced form of self-presentation. So I guess my concern, and you've spoken to it on a number of themes here, is each new generation has to develop a healthy sense of self. And wonderful writer Nick Carr, who has a recent book called Super Bloom about how information, shapes people's understanding of their world, said, we used to worry about narcissists staring into the water or, the narcissism of staring at oneself in a mirror all the time. And early social media use, there was that concern too. He said, but now it's almost like it's a disco ball, like a mirror ball. There's so many forms of self, and they're all very fractured and fragmented and constantly on the move. That is a really difficult baseline for developing healthy adult human flourishing. And I think we are seeing that. And the struggle is, I don't think we can judge each new young generation for how they're trying to adapt to this, because they grew up with this stuff. As you say, they grew up knowing they're being watched, knowing they have to perform. So how do we help them to the next stage of life and learn to understand what's good about these tools and what's actually quite harmful about them?
So this is what I was going to ask you. What do we do about all of that? And what do we do about that at the societal level? Is this something that can or should be fixed with public policy in any way? What do we do about all of that in the personal level? Is it just going out to meet our friends without our phones sometimes? What are concrete ways we can ensure that we, not all of the time perhaps, but more often have this unmediated experience of reality of our social situations, of convivial occasions?
So I always frustrate my editors to no end, because I'm a historian. I don't have to give you the solution, but actually I do have some thoughts on this. One is, we now have to actively defend the human. And what I mean by that is we have to really think about the areas of life where we don't want to mediate between human beings when they interact, whether that's in a classroom between a teacher and a student, whether that's in a nursing home where we actually don't want to give companions that are sealed like robots to old people, but instead encourage their children and grandchildren to visit them. So that we have to now choose it. And because it's a choice, we tend, again, out of whether it's laziness or inertia, we'll always choose the easy path. Choosing the human path is often now more of a challenge, but it's worth it. And we have to define where we are going to draw the lines on those. And I think the people to watch are as always, the artists and the creative people who are already, in terms of AI in particular, saying, no, human made. The human matters, and it matters for these reasons. That's an argument we have to actively make. And I see more and more people doing that. That's encouraging. I think we do need to give children back childhoods. I'm a huge fan of having enforceable age limits for social media use. There's going to be debate in each, locale about what that should be. Some say 14, some say 16, but those should be enforced. The internet and social media platforms were designed for adult use, not for kids. Just like we don't let kids drive cars without a license and reaching a certain level of maturity. There's no reason we can't make that argument too. And our policy world was designed to hash out the details. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But as adults, we also have to model better behavior, because one thing I was talking to a head of school who said that one of the biggest complaints among his kids who now they're not allowed cell phones bell to bell. That's another good thing. Schools should eliminate smartphones during the school hours. They shouldn't be part of the experience of these kids. He said the kids all complain their parents are always on their phone. So it's not enough to scold children. We have to acknowledge that we are modeling this behavior ourselves. And finally, I would say, go 24, 48 hours and do two things. Look people in the eye. Look around when you're in public space, and don't pick up your phone. When you're at a stoplight, when you're waiting for the bus, don't pick up your phone. You can take a book. You can just look around, let your mind wander, daydream, do all these things that we used to find ways to fill time, interstitial time before the phone. And you might just be bored and annoyed, but you also might find you have insights about things and notice things that you didn't before. And this seems very small and a little self-helpy, but I have to tell you, it does work. It's a practice I've really tried to make part of my own life, because I find myself reaching for that phone too often. And it's important to try that. But the main thing is face-to-face. As many opportunities as you can have to have face-to-face interactions with other people. We all need those acknowledgments. Look at the person who's checking you out if you still go to a grocery store rather than have things delivered to your door. Look at the human beings around you and connect to them, even in those small ways. It does actually make the world a more manageable place for everyone if we acknowledge each other in that very basic civil way.
I have agreed with many things you've said today, and I will try and follow this advice, perhaps with the exception of looking people in the eye on the New York subway.
That's all right. We'll let that one go.
The New York subway may not be the place to do that.
Well, yeah, that could be a threat, actually, on the subway.
Yeah, I think. Other than that, thank you so much, Christine, for this lovely conversation and for all of your insights.
Thank you.